Step out of the vehicle!
Easy, officer. I'm reaching for my ID.
Out! Now!
Look at it. Federal badge. FBI, special agent.
Get out of the car!
Door latch pops, hinges creak open.
Right now!
Are you serious?
Out!
You gotta be kidding me.
Seatbelt buckle!
The evening of March 14th began like any other for Special Agent Darnell Washington. The fluorescent lights of the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Charlotte field office hummed their familiar tune as he gathered his things from his desk on the 4th floor. Case files sat in neat stacks, each one representing months of meticulous work tracking down white-collar criminals who thought they could outsmart the system. Darnell had spent nearly 14 years proving them wrong, building a reputation as one of the most thorough investigators in the Southeast Division. His colleagues respected him not just for his results, but for the way he carried himself with a quiet dignity that never wavered, even in the most heated interrogations. At 43 years old, Darnell had seen enough to know that the world rarely operated the way it should. He had witnessed corruption at every level, had looked into the eyes of men who believed their wealth or their connections made them untouchable. Yet through it all, he maintained an almost stubborn faith in the system he had devoted his life to serving. Perhaps that faith came from his father, a Baptist minister who raised him to believe that righteousness would always find its way to the surface, no matter how deeply it was buried. Or perhaps it came from his own experience, from the countless times he had watched justice prevail when the evidence was undeniable. What Darnell did not yet know, as he slipped his service weapon into the locked compartment of his charcoal gray Ford Explorer that Wednesday evening, was that his faith was about to be tested in ways he had never imagined. The next few hours would challenge everything he believed about the institutions he served, about the badge he carried, and about his own ability to remain calm when faced with the kind of injustice he had spent his career fighting against. Before this night was over, his name would be spoken in living rooms and newsrooms across the nation, and a single traffic stop would spark a reckoning that one police department would never forget. But all of that was still ahead of him. For now, he was simply a tired man looking forward to his wife's cooking and the sound of his daughter's laughter. The drive from downtown Charlotte to his home in the Oakwood Heights subdivision usually took about 35 minutes, depending on traffic. Darnell had made this commute hundreds of times over the years, and he had grown to appreciate these quiet moments between the demands of his job and the responsibilities of home. The radio played softly, a jazz station his wife had programmed years ago that he had never bothered to change. Outside his window, the sky had begun its transformation from the pale blue of late afternoon to the deeper hues of approaching dusk. Streaks of amber and rose painted the horizon, the kind of sunset that made you want to pull over and simply watch. Traffic was lighter than usual for a Wednesday evening. Most of the commuters who normally clogged Interstate 485 had apparently decided to leave early or work late, leaving the highway blessedly clear. Darnell kept his speed steady at exactly 62 miles per hour, 2 miles below the posted limit. It was a habit born from years of training, an automatic discipline that had become second nature. He changed lanes smoothly, signaling well in advance, maintaining the kind of textbook driving that he had spent years teaching at the Bureau's defensive driving courses. His mind wandered to dinner. His wife, Patricia, had mentioned something about pot roast when he called her during his lunch break. Their daughter, Maya, had a school project due on Friday, something about the American Revolution that she had been researching for weeks. He made a mental note to ask her about it, to show interest in the things that mattered to her. At 16, Maya was pulling away the way teenagers do, carving out her own identity separate from her parents. Darnell understood this intellectually, but it still stung sometimes when she chose her phone over conversation at the dinner table. The exit for Riverside Parkway appeared ahead, and Darnell eased into the right lane. His neighborhood was another 10 minutes from here, through a series of well-maintained suburban streets lined with oak trees that had been planted when the development was built 20 years ago. He had chosen this neighborhood specifically for its safety, for its good schools, for the kind of quiet stability that he wanted his daughter to grow up surrounded by. The irony of what was about to happen in this supposedly safe environment would not be lost on him later. He was just passing the Chevron station at the corner of Riverside and Maple when he first noticed the lights in his rearview mirror. red and blue, flashing in that familiar pattern that immediately draws attention. Darnell's eyes flicked to the mirror, his training kicking in automatically. He noted the make and model of the patrol car, a standard Crown Victoria with the Riverside County Sheriff's Department markings. He checked his speedometer again, still 62. He ran through a mental checklist of possible issues. Registration, current, renewed just 2 months ago. Insurance, paid through November. Tail lights, he had checked them himself last weekend, a habit from his days as a rookie agent when a broken tail light had once compromised a surveillance operation. There was no reason for this stop. Darnell knew this with the certainty of a man who had spent his entire adult life in law enforcement. But he also knew the protocol, knew exactly what was expected of him in this situation. He had taught these procedures himself at community outreach events, standing in front of church groups and neighborhood associations, explaining how to interact with police officers during traffic stops. Stay calm, keep your hands visible, announce your movements before you make them. Do not argue, do not resist, do not give any officer a reason to escalate. These instructions had always felt slightly abstract when he delivered them, like advice about surviving a plane crash or a natural disaster. Important to know, but not something you ever expected to actually need. Now, as those lights grew larger in his mirror, Darnell felt the first subtle shift in his perspective. He was about to experience his own training from the other side. If this is your first time discovering this channel, you're in for something different. We tell real stories about real people facing extraordinary moments. Stories that make you think, that make you question, that remind you why justice matters. If you want to hear what happens next, and trust me, you do, take a second to subscribe and turn on notifications. This story is just getting started. Darnell activated his turn signal, a small thing, a gesture of compliance that he performed without conscious thought. He guided the Explorer toward the right shoulder, looking for a safe place to stop. Up ahead, he spotted a well-lit area near the entrance to a shopping center, the kind of location he would have recommended himself. Plenty of light, plenty of witnesses, plenty of cameras on the storefronts that might capture anything unusual. He eased the vehicle to a stop, shifted into park, and turned off the engine. The clock on his dashboard read 7:47 p.m. For a long moment, nothing happened. Darnell sat perfectly still, his hands resting at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, exactly where they could be easily seen. Through his side mirror, he watched the patrol car come to a stop about 15 feet behind him. The headlights were bright, intentionally so, designed to illuminate the interior of the stopped vehicle while keeping the officer in relative shadow. It was a tactical positioning that Darnell recognized and understood. He had no quarrel with proper procedure. The driver's door of the patrol car opened, and a figure emerged. From this angle, Darnell could make out the general outline. Male, average height, solid build. The officer approached slowly, his right hand resting on his hip near his service weapon. This was not unusual. Many officers maintain this posture during traffic stops as a precaution. What was unusual was the tension in the man's stride, the rigid set of his shoulders, the way his head moved in quick, jerky scans of the surrounding area as if expecting an ambush. Deputy Kevin Dawson had been with the Riverside County Sheriff's Department for just over 4 years. In that time, he had accumulated a file that his supervisors had consistently overlooked, a pattern of complaints that painted a troubling picture for anyone who cared to look closely enough. 7 formal complaints of excessive force, all involving black men. 4 instances of questionable stops that resulted in no citations or arrests. 2 internal reviews that had been closed with no action taken. Dawson had powerful friends in the department, relatives who had worn the same uniform before him, a family name that carried weight in the insular world of county law enforcement. None of this was known to Darnell as Dawson approached his window. He would learn it later, piece by piece, as the investigation unfolded. For now, he saw only a deputy sheriff doing his job, hopefully with a reasonable explanation for this stop. Dawson reached the driver's side window and stopped. His flashlight came up, its beam cutting through the gathering dusk to illuminate Darnell's face. There was no greeting, no polite introduction of the kind that department policy required. No, "Good evening, sir," or "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Just silence and the harsh glare of the flashlight, and eyes that seemed to be making calculations based on factors that had nothing to do with traffic violations. license and registration. The voice was flat, clipped, carrying an edge of hostility that seemed disproportionate to the situation. Darnell noted this but did not react. He had dealt with hostile personalities throughout his career. The key was to remain professional, to give no excuse for escalation. "Good evening, officer," Darnell said, his voice calm and measured. "I am going to reach into my glove compartment for my registration. Then I am going to reach into my back pocket for my wallet, which contains my license. Is that acceptable?" Dawson did not respond. His hand remained near his weapon, his eyes fixed on Darnell with an intensity that felt wildly out of proportion to a routine traffic stop. The flashlight beam did not waver. Darnell moved slowly, deliberately, exactly as he had taught others to move in these situations. He reached across to the glove compartment, opened it with exaggerated care, and retrieved the registration document. He held it up for a moment before placing it on the dashboard, visible and accessible. Then he shifted slightly, reaching toward his back pocket where he kept his wallet. "Slowly," Dawson said, the single word carrying an unmistakable warning. "Of course," Darnell replied. He extracted the wallet, a simple black leather bifold that Patricia had given him 2 Christmases ago. Inside was his driver's license, a few credit cards, and something else. Something that should have changed the entire trajectory of this encounter. His FBI credentials. Darnell opened the wallet and held it up so that both his license and his bureau identification were clearly visible. The gold badge caught the flashlight beam and reflected it back, unmistakable in its authority. Special Agent Darnell Washington, Federal Bureau of Investigation. 14 years of service, dozens of commendations, an impeccable record. All of it summarized in that small leather case, in those credentials that opened doors and commanded respect in law enforcement circles across the country. Dawson's eyes moved from Darnell's face to the credentials and back again. Something shifted in his expression, but it was not what Darnell expected. There was no recognition, no automatic deference, no sudden recalibration of the situation. Instead, something darker passed across Dawson's features, a hardening, a tightening around the jaw, a subtle flare of the nostrils that spoke of anger rather than respect. "Step out of the vehicle." The words hung in the air between them, wrong in a way that Darnell could feel in his bones. There was no explanation, no justification, no acknowledgement of the credentials he had just presented. Just an order, delivered in a tone that brooked no argument. "Deputy, I am a federal agent," Darnell said, keeping his voice steady despite the unease beginning to coil in his stomach. "May I ask what the reason for this stop is?" "I said step out of the vehicle. Now." Darnell's training warred with his instincts. Every protocol he knew said to comply, to sort out the misunderstanding later, to avoid any action that could be perceived as resistance. But another part of him, the part that had spent 14 years upholding the law, rebelled against the blatant disregard being shown to his credentials. He had identified himself as a federal agent, and he was being treated like a suspect. Before he could respond, a second patrol car pulled up behind the first, its lights adding to the red and blue chaos reflecting off the nearby buildings. Another deputy emerged, this one younger, moving with the nervous energy of someone who did not quite understand the situation but was eager to be part of it. He went immediately to the passenger side of Darnell's Explorer, shining his flashlight through the window, scanning the interior with undisguised suspicion. Darnell made a decision. He would comply. He would document everything, and he would deal with this through proper channels, the way the system was designed to work. He opened the door slowly and stepped out of the vehicle. The air outside was cooler than he expected, carrying the first hints of the spring evening that had been developing while he sat in his climate-controlled car. The shopping center behind him had a handful of customers coming and going, people living their ordinary lives just a few dozen yards away from what was becoming an increasingly extraordinary situation. Darnell stood beside his vehicle, keeping his hands visible, projecting the calm competence that had defined his entire career. Dawson circled around to face him, his hand still hovering near his weapon. Up close, Darnell could see details he had missed before. The slight flush on the deputy's cheeks, whether from exertion or emotion, he could not tell. The way his eyes kept darting to Darnell's hands, his waist, his face, as if searching for something that was not there. The total absence of the professional detachment that good officers learn to maintain. Hands on the hood. "Deputy, I have identified myself as a federal agent. I have committed no traffic violation. I am asking you, respectfully, to explain why I have been stopped. I am not going to ask again. The second deputy had finished his cursory inspection of the passenger side and was now approaching, positioning himself at an angle that Darnell recognized as a tactical flanking maneuver, 2 against 1, the classic setup for a high-risk stop. Except this was not a high-risk stop. This was a 43-year-old man in a dress shirt and tie, standing beside a sensible SUV on his way home from work. Darnell placed his hands on the hood of his Explorer. The metal was still warm from the engine, but it felt cold against his palms. Beneath his fingertips, he could feel the slight vibration of humiliation beginning to set in, the slow burning recognition that something fundamental was being violated here, not just his rights, though those too. Something deeper, his dignity, his sense of self, his belief that the badge he carried meant something, that it would protect him from this kind of treatment. The pat-down that followed was thorough in a way that bordered on aggressive. Dawson's hands moved roughly over Darnell's body, lingering in places, pressing harder than necessary. It was the kind of search that spoke of animosity rather than procedure, designed to humiliate rather than to ensure safety. Darnell endured it in silence, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the last light of sunset was fading into darkness. "He has got nothing," Dawson announced to his partner, but there was no relief in his voice. If anything, he sounded disappointed. "My service weapon is in a locked compartment in the center console," Darnell said, his voice steady despite everything. "It is registered and authorized. I am informing you of its presence as a matter of professional courtesy." The second deputy had already opened the passenger door and was reaching into the Explorer. Darnell heard the sound of papers rustling, compartments opening, the intimate violations of a search being conducted without consent or probable cause. "I do not consent to any search of my vehicle," Darnell stated clearly, loudly enough for anyone nearby to hear. "I am asserting my Fourth Amendment rights." Dawson ignored him completely. "Check that compartment," he called to his partner. The younger deputy found the locked case, struggled with it for a moment, then brought it to Dawson. "It is locked. Open it." "The code is 4729, Darnell said. There was no point in resistance now. The search was happening whether he consented or not, but he would document every violation, every breach of protocol, every moment of this encounter, and when the time came, the system would hold these men accountable. It had to. The compartment opened to reveal his Bureau-issued Glock 19, secured in its holster. Dawson retrieved it, holding it up as if he had just discovered evidence of a crime rather than a legally authorized firearm carried by a federal law enforcement officer. "Concealed weapon," Dawson announced, his voice carrying a note of triumph that made Darnell's stomach turn. "That weapon is registered with the Federal Bureau of Investigation and authorized under federal law," Darnell responded. "I have already identified myself as a federal agent. You have seen my credentials." But Dawson was no longer listening. His attention had shifted to the gathering crowd, the handful of people who had noticed the flashing lights and stopped to watch. Several of them had their phones out, the small screens glowing in the darkness as they recorded what was happening. The age of accountability, Darnell thought. Every citizen a potential witness, every phone a potential camera. It was one of the few things that gave him hope in this moment. What happened next would later be viewed more than 3 million times. It would be analyzed by legal experts, discussed on cable news, shared in group chats and family dinners and community meetings across the country. It would become, in its own way, a kind of symbol, a 3-minute encapsulation of everything that was wrong with a system that too often treated some citizens differently than others. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back." The words seemed to come from very far away, even though Dawson was standing just a few feet from Darnell. Time had begun to move strangely, the way it does in moments of extreme stress or disbelief. Darnell heard the words, understood their meaning, but could not quite accept that they were being directed at him. "Deputy, I am a federal agent. I have committed no crime. I have cooperated fully with every request you have made. On what grounds are you placing me under arrest?" "Suspicious activity. Hands behind your back. Now." Suspicious activity. 2 words that meant nothing and everything. 2 words that could be stretched to cover any situation, any person, any excuse. two words that had been used countless times to justify the unjustifiable, to provide legal cover for actions that had no legitimate basis. Darnell felt the handcuffs close around his wrists. The metal was cold, biting into his skin with an efficiency that spoke of frequent use. Behind him, he could hear the clicks of camera phones, the murmur of the crowd, the distant sound of traffic continuing its ordinary flow. The world kept moving, indifferent to the small drama playing out on this suburban roadside. Let me pause here to ask you something. Have you ever been in a situation where you knew with absolute certainty that something wrong was happening to you, and yet you had no power to stop it? Where the systems that were supposed to protect you became the very things threatening you? If you have a story like that, share it in the comments, because moments like these connect us, remind us that we are not alone in facing injustice. And if this kind of content matters to you, make sure you are subscribed, because there is much more of this story to tell. They put him in the back of the patrol car. It was cramped, designed more for intimidation than comfort. A metal cage separated him from the front seats, and the bench was hard plastic, molded in a way that made it impossible to sit comfortably with your hands cuffed behind your back. Darnell had been in plenty of patrol cars over the years, but always in the front seat. Always as a colleague, always as someone who belonged in the world of law enforcement rather than someone being processed by it. The view from back here was different. Through the window, he could see the crowd continuing to grow. More phones, more witnesses, more potential evidence. He could see Dawson conferring with his partner, their body language suggesting a conversation that was not going well. And he could see his own Explorer, doors hanging open, its interior exposed to the world like the scene of a crime. Time passed. Darnell had no way to mark it precisely, his watch hidden beneath the handcuffs that were now cutting into his wrists. It felt like hours, though later he would learn it was closer to 45 minutes. 45 minutes of sitting in the back of a patrol car, a federal agent treated like a common criminal, while two deputies tried to figure out how to justify what they had done. Through the window, Darnell watched as they searched his vehicle with increasing desperation. They went through his briefcase, scattering papers that represented months of careful work on sensitive cases. They opened his gym bag, pulling out workout clothes and examining them as if they might contain contraband. They found his bureau laptop and began to open it before Darnell shouted through the glass, "That device contains classified federal documents. You are not authorized to access it." Whether it was his warning or their own belated recognition of how far they had gone, they put the laptop back. But the damage was already done. The violation had already occurred. The line had already been crossed, and there was no going back. A third vehicle arrived, this one unmarked but carrying the authority of a supervisor. Sergeant Michael Torres had been enjoying a quiet dinner at home when his phone began buzzing with messages from dispatch. A deputy had detained someone who claimed to be a federal agent. The situation was complicated. His presence was requested. Torres was a 22-year veteran of the department, a man who had seen enough to recognize trouble when it appeared. He had also, in recent years, begun to feel the weight of changes happening in law enforcement across the country, the increased scrutiny, the demands for accountability, the growing recognition that old ways of doing things might not survive the light of public attention. He arrived at the scene with a sense of foreboding that only deepened when he saw the crowd of onlookers, their phones held up like torches in the darkness. His first stop was Darnell's Explorer. He examined the taillights himself, walking slowly around the vehicle, checking each one carefully. Both worked perfectly. No malfunction, no damage. No possible justification for a traffic stop based on equipment violation. His second stop was Dawson, who was standing near his patrol car with the nervous energy of a man who knew he had made a mistake, but could not yet admit it. "Walk me through it," Torres said, his voice carefully neutral. Dawson's account was a masterpiece of contradiction. First, he claimed he had observed a broken taillight. When Torres pointed out that both lights were functioning, Dawson pivoted to a different story. The vehicle matched the description of one involved in a robbery earlier that day. When Torres asked for the bulletin number or any documentation of this supposed matching vehicle, Dawson could not provide it. The story shifted again, this time to suspicious driving behavior, though Dawson could not articulate what specifically had been suspicious. Torres listened to all of this with a sinking feeling in his stomach. He had seen this pattern before, though usually it was handled quietly, internally, without federal agents and crowds of witnesses and phones recording everything. This was different. This was the kind of situation that could not be buried in paperwork and forgotten. He walked to the patrol car where Darnell sat and opened the rear door. "Sir, you are free to go." 4 words. No apology, no explanation, no acknowledgement of the wrong that had been done. Just a release, as if the previous 45 minutes had been some kind of administrative hiccup, rather than a profound violation of rights and dignity. Darnell stepped out of the patrol car and held up his wrists. The handcuffs had left red marks that would take days to fade, physical evidence of the psychological wound that had been inflicted. Torres removed the cuffs without comment, though his eyes lingered on the marks they had left. "I want your name and badge number," Darnell said. "Yours and the deputies who conducted this stop." Torres provided his own information without hesitation. Dawson was more reluctant, but eventually complied under the sergeant's pointed stare. The younger deputy mumbled his information, already seeming to understand that he had participated in something that might have serious consequences. Darnell walked back to his Explorer, surveying the damage. His papers were scattered across the seats. His personal belongings had been rifled through. His sense of security had been violated in ways that would take much longer to repair. He began the slow process of putting things back in order, aware that the crowd was still watching, still recording, still bearing witness to the aftermath of injustice. One of the onlookers, a young woman in her 20s, approached him as the patrol cars began to pull away. "Are you okay?" she asked. Darnell looked at her phone still held in her hand, at the concern in her eyes. "I will be," he said. "I recorded the whole thing," she said. "Do you want me to send it to you?" He thought about it for a moment. Part of him wanted to handle this through official channels only, to trust the system to correct itself. But another part of him, the part that had just spent 45 minutes in the back of a patrol car for no reason at all, understood that the system did not always correct itself. Sometimes it needed help. Sometimes it needed witnesses. "Yes," he said. "Please do." The drive home took another 15 minutes. Darnell moved slowly, carefully, hyper-aware of every other vehicle on the road, every potential threat. The jazz station was still playing, but he did not hear it. His mind was elsewhere, processing what had happened, beginning the long work of understanding what it meant. Patricia was waiting at the door when he pulled into the driveway. She had expected him home an hour ago, and the worry was evident in her face even before he got out of the car. "What happened?" she asked, taking in his disheveled appearance, the marks on his wrists, the look in his eyes. Darnell did not answer immediately. He walked past her into the house, into the kitchen, and sat down heavily at the table where they had shared thousands of meals over the years. Maya looked up from her homework, immediately sensing that something was wrong. "Dad, I was stopped tonight," Darnell said finally, "by county sheriffs. They pulled me over for no reason, searched my car without consent, and put me in handcuffs for almost an hour." "What?" Patricia's voice carried disbelief. "Did you show them your credentials?" "I showed them everything. It did not matter. They saw the badge, and it only made things worse." Maya had put down her pencil. At 16, she was old enough to understand what her father was saying, to grasp its implications. She had grown up in a household where law enforcement was not an abstraction but a daily reality, where her father's work was a source of pride. Now she was seeing the other side of that reality, the side that had always existed, but that her parents had tried to protect her from. "What are you going to do?" she asked. Darnell looked at his daughter, at the mixture of anger and fear in her eyes, and made a decision. "I'm going to do what I always do," he said. "I'm going to follow the evidence. I'm going to use the system. And I am going to make sure this does not happen to anyone else because of these officers." He did not sleep well that night. The marks on his wrists throbbed, a physical reminder of what had happened. But more than that, his mind kept returning to the moment when Dawson had seen his credentials, when the FBI badge should have changed everything, and instead had made things worse. What did that say about the system he had devoted his life to? What did it say about the protections he had always assumed would be there for him? These questions would have to wait. For now, there was work to do. By 6 a.m. the next morning, Darnell was on the phone with his supervisor at the Bureau. By 8 a.m., the video had already begun its journey across the internet, uploaded by the young woman who had witnessed everything. By noon, it had over 500,000 views and was climbing rapidly. The footage was damning in its clarity. It showed a well-dressed black man standing calmly beside his vehicle while a white deputy patted him down aggressively. It showed the man being placed in handcuffs despite offering no resistance. It showed him being put in the back of a patrol car while other officers ransacked his SUV. And most damning of all, it showed the moment when he held up his credentials, when the gold badge of the Federal Bureau of Investigation caught the light and reflected it back, and the officers continued their treatment unchanged. Comments began pouring in, first dozens, then hundreds, then thousands. People shared their own stories of similar encounters, their own experiences of being treated as suspects rather than citizens. Legal experts weighed in, pointing out the numerous violations of procedure and law. Civil rights organizations began paying attention. News outlets reached out for comment. The story had taken on a life of its own. If you are finding value in this story, if it is making you think about justice and accountability and the systems that shape our lives, take a moment to hit that subscribe button. Stories like this one need to be told, and they need to be heard. Your support makes that possible. The official response began that afternoon. The Riverside County Sheriff's Department released a carefully worded statement acknowledging that one of their deputies had conducted a traffic stop involving a federal agent and that the matter was under internal review. The statement expressed confidence in their review process and asked for patience as the facts were gathered. For Darnell, this was not enough. He had spent 14 years watching institutions protect themselves at the expense of truth. He knew how internal reviews worked, knew how they could be managed and manipulated to produce predetermined outcomes. This time would be different. Working with the Bureau's legal department, he filed a formal complaint that documented every violation in precise detail: the stop without probable cause, the search without consent, the detention without legitimate grounds, the aggressive handling despite full compliance, the seizure of a legally authorized firearm, the access to sensitive government documents. Each item was cataloged, time-stamped, and supported by the video evidence that millions of people had now seen. But the complaint went deeper than the events of that single night. It requested a full review of Deputy Kevin Dawson's personnel file, arguing that the nature of the incident suggested a pattern rather than an isolated event. This request, backed by the weight of the FBI, could not be quietly denied. What emerged from that file was worse than anyone had expected. 7 formal complaints of excessive force over 4 years, all involving black men. Not a single one had resulted in meaningful disciplinary action. Some had been dismissed as unfounded. Others had been acknowledged but excused as the inevitable friction of difficult police work. The pattern was clear. Dawson had been targeting black drivers for years, and the department had been looking the other way. The implications spread outward like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. If Dawson's behavior had been enabled for this long, what about other officers? What about other departments? The questions being asked in comment sections and newsrooms began to echo in city council chambers and state legislatures. This was not just about one traffic stop anymore. It was about a system that allowed stops like this to happen, again and again, until someone with the resources and the platform to fight back finally did. 3 weeks after the incident, Deputy Kevin Dawson was placed on unpaid administrative leave. The announcement came not from the Sheriff's Department, but from the County Board of Supervisors, who had grown increasingly uncomfortable with the national attention being focused on their small corner of the country. The internal investigation that followed was more thorough than most, perhaps because so many eyes were watching. It confirmed what the video had already shown. There was no legitimate basis for the stop, no justification for the search, no grounds for the detention. It also revealed something else, something that the department had not anticipated. Dawson's dashboard camera had been recording the entire encounter. The footage, which department policy should have required to be preserved and reviewed, had been flagged for deletion as part of a routine data management process. Only the intervention of federal investigators prevented its destruction. That footage showed what the civilian videos had not captured: Dawson's behavior before he approached Darnell's vehicle. The way he had pulled up behind the Explorer observed the driver for a moment and reached for his radio. The words he had spoken to dispatch: "I have got a black male in a nice SUV. Going to check it out." Those words preserved by accident and luck stripped away any remaining pretense. This was not a case of mistaken identity or equipment malfunction or suspicious behavior. This was racial profiling, documented and undeniable. Deputy Kevin Dawson was terminated 6 weeks after the incident. The second deputy who had participated in the search was suspended for 30 days and required to complete additional training. Sergeant Torres, who had arrived after the damage was done, was not disciplined but was transferred to an administrative position. For many observers, these consequences seemed inadequate given the magnitude of the violation. But they were more than had been achieved in countless similar cases where the victim lacked the credentials, the resources, or the platform to demand accountability. The civil suit was filed 2 months after the termination. Darnell's attorneys, working alongside Bureau counsel, documented a pattern of constitutional violations that went beyond the events of March 14th. They presented the statistical evidence of disproportionate stops, the history of buried complaints, the systemic failures that had allowed Dawson to operate unchecked for years. The county settled for $1.8 million without admitting wrongdoing, a legal fiction that satisfied no one but allowed the matter to be closed. As part of the settlement, the department agreed to implement new training protocols, new oversight mechanisms, and new reporting requirements for traffic stops. Darnell took the money and did something unexpected with it. He established a foundation in his daughter's name, the Maya Washington Initiative, dedicated to building bridges between law enforcement and the communities they serve. The foundation would fund mentorship programs, education initiatives, and legal resources for those who could not afford to fight back against injustice. "I did not want their money for myself," he explained later. "I wanted it to mean something. I wanted it to create change." But perhaps the most meaningful moment came 6 months after the incident, when Darnell returned to Riverside County at the invitation of a community group. The event was held at a community center in a neighborhood that had long had a troubled relationship with local law enforcement. The audience was mostly young people, teenagers, and young adults who had grown up viewing police as threats rather than protectors. Darnell stood before them without notes, without prepared remarks, speaking from the heart. "I am going to tell you something that might surprise you," he began. "I still believe in the law. I still believe in the system. Not because it is perfect, because it is not. Not because it always works, because it does not. But because it is the only tool we have for creating a just society." He paused, looking out at the faces before him. "What happened to me that night was wrong. It was a violation of everything I have spent my career defending. And it was not unique. It happens every day. To people who do not have a badge to flash or a platform to speak from, people who suffer in silence because they believe no one will listen, no one will care, no one will help them. But here is what I learned that night. The world is watching now in ways it never has before. Every phone is a camera. Every witness is a potential voice for truth. The same technology that can be used to spread hate and division can also be used to expose injustice and demand accountability. When I was sitting in the back of that patrol car, my wrists bleeding from handcuffs I did not deserve, I made myself a promise. I promised that I would not let this break me. I would not let it make me bitter or hopeless. I would use it. I would turn it into something meaningful. He looked at the young people before him, saw the mixture of skepticism and hope in their eyes. "You have power," he said, "more than you know. The power to document, to speak, to organize, to demand better. Use it. When you see injustice, do not look away. When you have the opportunity to stand up, stand up. When someone tells you that nothing will ever change, prove them wrong, because change is possible. I know, because I have seen it. Not the dramatic overnight transformation that we sometimes dream about, but the slow, steady progress that comes from people refusing to accept injustice, from communities demanding accountability, from individuals choosing courage over comfort. They picked the wrong person that night, not because I am special, but because I had the tools to fight back. My job now is to make sure everyone has those tools. My job is to make sure that the next person who faces what I faced does not have to face it alone. The applause that followed was not polite or perfunctory. It was the sound of recognition, of solidarity, of hope cautiously rekindled. In that room, something shifted. Not everything, not permanently, but something. And perhaps that is all any of us can do. Shift something. Move the needle, however slightly, toward justice. Plant seeds that others will water and tend. Build foundations that others will build upon. The video of Darnell's arrest eventually reached over 4 million views. It became a case study in police training academies, an example of how not to conduct a traffic stop. It was cited in legislative hearings, referenced in academic papers, discussed in countless conversations about race and policing in America. But for Darnell, the most meaningful response came from unexpected quarters, letters from other law enforcement officers thanking him for speaking out, messages from Black parents grateful for a story with an ending that did not involve tragedy, notes from young people who had been inspired to pursue careers in law or public service. One letter in particular stayed with him. It was from a young man in Chicago who had been stopped by police twice in the previous year, both times without justification, both times ending with humiliation rather than handcuffs. He had been ready to give up, to accept that this was simply how things were. Then he saw the video. "You showed me that it does not have to be this way." The letter read, "You showed me that you can fight back without losing yourself. You showed me that dignity is not something they can take from you, no matter what they do. Thank you for that." Darnell keeps that letter in his desk drawer, a reminder of why the fight matters. A reminder that even in the darkest moments, when the handcuffs are biting into your wrists and everything you have worked for seems meaningless, there is a larger purpose, a longer arc, a story that is still being written. If you have made it this far, thank you. Thank you for caring about stories like this one, stories that remind us of both the brokenness and the possibility of our systems. If you want to see more content that examines justice, power, and the human capacity for both cruelty and courage, subscribe to this channel. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment telling me what you would have done in Darnell's shoes, whether you think the system can really change, whether stories like this give you hope or despair. Because the conversation does not end when the video stops. It continues in living rooms and classrooms, in courtrooms and council chambers, in the quiet moments when we decide what kind of society we want to build. Deputy Dawson is gone from the force, but the conditions that created him remain in countless departments across the country. The settlement was paid, but the underlying issues persist. The policies were changed in Riverside County, but similar policies remain unchanged elsewhere. Progress is not a destination, it is a direction. And stories like Darnell's remind us which way we need to be moving. Some people watching the video of that night saw only what they expected to see, a confrontation between police and a citizen, ending in release rather than arrest. Just another traffic stop, just another controversy, just another item in an endless scroll of content to be consumed and forgotten. But others saw something more. They saw a man who refused to let injustice define him, who responded to humiliation with dignity, to abuse with composure, to hatred with something that looked remarkably like love. Not a passive love, not an accepting love, but a fierce love that demanded better from everyone involved. That love is still demanding, still working, still believing that change is possible, even when the evidence seems overwhelming that it is not. In the end, that may be Darnell Washington's greatest legacy. Not the lawsuit, not the settlement, not the policy changes, but the example he set. The proof he provided that you can face the worst of a system and still believe in its capacity for good, that you can be knocked down and get back up, that you can turn pain into purpose and humiliation into hope. They picked the wrong man that night, and the wrong man showed all of us what right looks like. That is the story. That is the lesson. That is the challenge that now belongs to each of us. What will you do with it?